Hello! Today we're going to be examining the quick menu for the Canon T7 and T6. Let's get into it. So today we're going to be examining step by step the quick menu for the Canon T6 and T7. I say both cameras because it's the same quick menu for both cameras. And so this is that readily accessible, most important features menu that you get to right on the front of either of those cameras. We're going to be going through each one of those features today with a little bit of explanation on what each one of those features can do for you. Now, today's video is brought to you both by my own business, Camera Lessons Online. You're watching my YouTube channel right now where I teach photography skills, as well as I've got the website where I have a 4-hour introduction to photography course filled with all the essential knowledge you need to get up and running and shoot pictures with as much creative control as you want. Very much worth checking out. Also, it describes the 2 books that I have published, Macro Photography 0 to 60 and Travel Photography 0 to 60. Both of those are described on there. I would also make sure to let you know that the camera that I'm using today was made available to me by Mike's Camera, mikescamera.com. I'm going to put the website down there. They have wonderful gear for sale and for rent, everything that us photographers are looking for, and they were very kind in letting me use this camera for today's video. Without further ado, we've got a lot to get into, and so let's take a look at the quick menu for the Canon T6 and T7. This is what your quick menu is going to look like. At the top left, we have the shooting mode that you find yourself in. And so right now we are in program mode, and that's really where I expect people to kind of start with this camera if they've never shot with an interchangeable lens camera before. The next 2 spaces beside it are blank. Those are shutter speed and aperture, which we don't control yet in a programmable mode, but in aperture priority, shutter priority, and manual, we will. The second that we actually meter a shot, which you'll initially do just by pushing your shutter release button down halfway, then exposure information's going to show up there, a shutter speed and an aperture. In aperture priority, you would actually see the aperture full time because you can always select it. The same is true then in shutter priority mode, and in manual, you'll see both full time. So what we're going to do is just scroll up to the top here, and we're going to start with ISO. Now, ISO is our control over our sensitivity to light. It starts in auto mode when we take the camera out of the box, but we can decide a numerical value. And what this is going to do is, as we increase the ISO, we are more sensitive to light. That will allow us to shoot in a darker environment or to achieve a faster shutter speed in that same environment. And please notice that at the bottom, it's going to tell us circumstances when we might use these individual ISO values. And that's a very useful thing. So just as an example, in 3200 ISO, it says this is going to keep images stable in dark environments. The reason is we're very sensitive to light because it's a higher number. That allows for a faster relative shutter speed. So it's an artificial way of controlling shutter speed, and that's a really useful skill to have right at the beginning of shooting when we are indirectly controlling shutter and aperture rather than directly controlling shutter and aperture. So next thing here, this is going to be exposure compensation, and we're going to see negative numbers and positive numbers. Now, so long as we're not in manual, the camera is going to decide the overall level of brightness of an individual shot. But here we can't alter that brightness. Negative numbers will make the image darker, and positive numbers are going to make the images brighter. Now, if we spin the dial as it's showing, we're going to have these 3 bars, and this is called auto exposure bracketing. In short, auto exposure bracketing is shooting 3 pictures at these 3 brightness levels. In this case, 1 stop underexposed, 1 at 0 or neutral, or you can also think of that as what the camera believes is correct, and 1 stop brighter. Now, the stop system and aperture and shutter is something that we introduce as we really explore exposure theory in photography, so we're not going to delve into that too much today, but know that this is a standardized value in brightness in photography. And we could start working with these values immediately, even if we don't understand them right off the bat. So 0 is not magical. It's just what the camera believes is correct based on your particular metering mode, which we're going to get into in just a little bit. So next over here we have the flash exposure compensation. So the last one was the exposure compensation, and that's how the camera adjusts aperture, shutter, and ISO. Flash exposure compensation, still negative and positive values in the stop system, and this is changing the brightness of either the pop-up flash or if you attach an auxiliary flash to the camera, how bright that auxiliary flash is going to be. So we can alter that relative brightness. Next, we are going to take a look at this next thing, and this is called the picture style. And picture style is particularly important if you shoot images in JPEG. By the way, we're not going to get into RAW shooting in this video, but please do check it out. I have a video on the importance of shooting in RAW. So when you shoot a JPEG image in particular, though this does affect the initial saving of a RAW file, you get the choice on how the camera alters a few factors in how it processes the file, such as the contrast that's added to the image, what's called the clarity or the sharpness, and that's the contrast at the edges of objects, and the saturation of the color. And we have a couple different scenarios. So first is auto, right? So a little bit of boost in each of those environments. Standard, which is, again, a relative boost, small amount for each one of those factors. But by the way, you can go in and adjust these. And then we're going to have portrait and landscape. And these are going to not boost the contrast of the people's skin tone in portrait, though it might add clarity, and the landscape will definitely be adding some more color, saturation, and vividness. Now, for anybody shooting in RAW files, I find it really useful to shoot in neutral, which has no added enhancement to your image, assuming you will do that work yourself. We have a condition for your more color neutral situations. That's as faithful. And by the way, I'm showing here that we can enter into any one of these and adjust the sharpness, contrast, and saturation to our overall desire, and color tone at the bottom, which is basically a color temperature control. So we can adjust these to the way that we want a faithful shot to look or a landscape shot to look. And this is something I think a JPEG shooter would utilize because you get less editing control with a JPEG image in post-production, so we might as well save the image in a way that you want at that moment of capture. M is for monochrome, which we're going to get to here in a second, and that's just going to be a black and white, but we can still add contrast. And then you have 3 different presets that you can add on top of these. If you are shooting JPEGs in camera, then working with these might be useful to get your images to look the way you want. But if you are shooting RAW images, then I would just shoot in neutral in this particular situation, and I would edit the images myself to my own liking. So that would be my thought process on it. Next, we have white balance, which is adjusting for the color of light in an environment. In auto, the camera on a shot-for-shot basis changes the way that it processes color, either cooler or warmer, maybe adding greens or magentas. That's called the tint as opposed to the Kelvin, in order to get the shot the way that we want. Now, if I'm shooting in an environment, then picking the type of color temperature is going to actually give me the ability here to be more accurate, because in auto white balance, the color of the scene in front of me, the color of the grass, the color of the shirt somebody's wearing, might affect the white balance, and I might get incorrect color accuracy. Telling the camera sunny day or cloudy day or shade, which is what we're looking at there, can be immensely powerful in getting accurate color. If I'm outside, I am always in sunlight white balance. Shade, cloudy day, very useful. Tungsten, I use a lot. Fluorescent, I have a little bit less common use factor for, and the reason is there are so many types of fluorescents that I find that the fluorescent actually programmed into a camera's white balance setting typically doesn't match the situation I'm in. One I use all the time is this next one, the flash. I'm working under video lights and studio strobes and flashes a lot, and as a result, having a white balance set for these man-made lighting instruments can be very useful. But probably the most powerful is our custom white balance. This is where we shoot a picture of a color neutral object. You do want this to actually be 18% gray, by the way. White can reflect the color of lights around it or objects around it. And just picking something that's randomly gray, it might have more greens or magentas or other types of colors built into it. But photographic 18% gray is a fantastic tool. We take a photograph of it, and then in post-production, you can either use that to correct your white balance, but custom white balance in the camera says you're going to choose the photograph of that 18% gray card, and it will use it to build a custom profile for that exact lighting circumstance that you're in. This is a way of getting perfectly accurate color in the moment, and it really does work very, very well. So the part of the quick menu that's blank here is for custom white balance settings, where you can manually adjust and add a little bit of yellow or a little bit of cyan back into a custom white balance. Since we're not working with that right now, we don't have access to that particular menu, but that's what's there. Not something I've really worked with. Once I do a measurement off of a 18% gray card or cloth, I have typically been very, very happy with exactly the color temperature that I recorded. Anyway, next is going to be our autocorrect. You can think of this as an auto enhancement feature inside of the camera, and I really like this. It works. So this is adding some brightness and contrast to your images. Don't turn this on too much or your images can really start to look a little cartoony. So I would put this at low, but I actually do like it. I do leave this on. So kind of a useful thing there. It defaults off, but I do like to use it. All right, so next is the simplest button on the quick menu. This is literally just a button you press to pop up the built-in flash in the camera. That's it. That's what it does. You also have a button on the side of the camera that does that as well, but they put one into the quick menu just to have a fast, easy way of getting to pretty much everything. And to my knowledge right now, they're the only company that does that in a quick menu, which is kind of cool if you think about it. Just a nice little added tip, added little thing that they've got. So this next thing is important. This is the autofocus operation. So we're going to talk about these, and this is how the camera is constantly, or if it is constantly, adjusting focus. So you've got three options. Let's go through them. One shot means that I focus, and then it will lock focus at that particular distance, and it will hold focus at that distance until I release that shutter mechanism and focus again. That's called one shot. Push it in, I focus, and I'm good to go. Now, this is great for any non-moving object. We shoot portraits this way. We shoot landscapes this way. We shoot macros this way. We shoot architecture, street photography this way. It's great. Now, one thing that you're going to find is a lot of cameras will come out of the box with AI focus turned on. That's this next option here. I am not a fan of AI focus. The basic autofocus, auto-determinate focus in cameras, I'm not a big fan of. And the reason is just quite simply, in this mode, the camera has permission. It tells you at the bottom here. It has permission to decide for you if you should be in one shot or AI servo. In other words, it has permission to decide for you if your subject is moving or not, and it can and will switch focus distances if it thinks your subject is moving. Now, I don't like that at all because I'm in charge of my own photograph, and I know if my subject is likely to move. And if my subject is likely to move, I'm going to be in AI servo, which makes a lot more sense. So I'm not a big fan of AI focus. I forget if the T6 and T7 come out of the box set this way. If they are, switch it over to one shot or AI servo. That's what I would do. Now, AI servo is for any kind of a moving subject. As long as you're pushing your focusing button in, and if it's the shutter release button that's halfway or all the way, then it is constantly adjusting focus. This is for any moving subject, all right? Now, we're going to get into what's called the focusing area in a second, and that's where this camera is looking for a subject to focus on, and that's going to be an important technique when we are using AI servo. But this is for any kind of a moving subject. Put yourself here for anything from shooting pictures of the kids at a park to shooting a baseball game or whatever, and this is not going to let you down. Very, very good system. So one shot for non-moving, AI servo for moving. Don't use AI focus. It's just not going to be essential to your photography lifestyle. So the next thing is going to be what's called the drive mode, and this is what happens when you push the shutter release button in. You get a couple options. you're going to have the box on the left, and that's single shot. Now, what that means is you push the shutter release button in, you get one picture, that's the end of it, until you release the shutter button and push it in again, in which case you get one picture. The next one over is your burst shooting or your continuous shooting. So long as you're pushing the shutter release button down, it will continue shooting pictures at about 4 or 5 frames a second, which is very, very nice. Now, an important thing to know is if you're shooting these higher bursts, you want to make sure you have a fast memory card. So a memory card I would put into this camera would at minimum say U1 on it, though I would recommend if you're buying new memory cards, only buy U3s. This camera is UHS-1 protocol, which means one row of flash memory. If it's not labeled, then it's UHS-1, but U3 is what I would have for this particular camera. So that's what I would be using for this. They're inexpensive. I would retire anything that's class 10 only. I would retire anything that is U1 only and look at U3s, and that will let you shoot these bursts for longer, which is very, very nice. Next, we're going to have our timers. So here we've got our 10-second timer. Now, 10-second timer is particularly useful to start it and run and get into the picture. Your 2-second timer, of course, you're not going to get into the picture, but this is for if you're shooting a long exposure, a night scene, something where you want to make sure nothing can move the camera. Because in really long exposures, the mere fact that you push the shutter release button down can shake the camera enough to blur the image. And so 2-second timers exist so that you can make sure that nothing is touching or moving the camera for a longer exposure shot. These are very, very useful. 2-second and 10-second timers. The last one is a continuous timer. You notice we have a 2 and we have an up arrow. So this is going to do a 10-second timer, and then it's going to shoot not one picture, but multiple, minimum of 2. And that is for the group family shot where your Uncle Bob always has his eyes closed in a group photograph. So instead, you press the up button, you choose a number of photographs between 2 and I believe it's 10, and you will get the camera to shoot that many pictures after the 10-second timer. Just tell everyone to keep smiling and expect it. Otherwise, it's a bunch of people, not smiling and just staring at the camera wondering why it's making noise. But this is super useful for those larger group shots. Definitely take advantage of the continuous timer. You noticed a second ago that I went back in and I changed the drive mode for single shot to burst. Let's talk about that for a second, because this is a good tip for you. My cameras are never left in single shot mode. Not ever. In this particular camera, you either have burst on or off, right? Multiple pictures or one picture. There's no variation in between, so we don't have to worry about choices there. But I would always have this camera in burst mode or timer if you're finding that useful. The reason is we set up the camera, and if I have it in burst mode, I can press the shutter quickly and take only one picture. And that's fine. I'll do that a lot. But what if all of a sudden something interesting happens? What if a deer walks out of those woods where I'm setting up a landscape shot? Now, I need to shoot as many pictures as I can before it walks away. I want to be in a position to shoot those images with the least amount of change on my camera that I have to do for risk of missing the shot. So I'll always leave a camera in burst mode. That's why I changed it back there. That's my habit, and I would encourage you to develop the same habit. All right, let's take a look at metering mode. And metering mode is where we are telling the camera when it's building the exposure, how bright or dark to make the image, where is it looking within the frame to evaluate light to make that decision? So you have 3 options here. This first one here is center weighted averaging. I actually believe this is where most cameras should be left. The way we shoot most photographs is by taking an object or our subject, putting it in the middle of the frame and snapping a picture. So we might as well really heavily rely on the light on that subject in the center of the frame. But cameras do not ship that way. Cameras actually ship in evaluative metering mode. And evaluative is going to be something that averages the entirety of the frame when deciding exposure, but does put emphasis on the point of focus. Now, center-weighted metering doesn't rely on point of focus at all, but evaluative metering does. Your smallest amount of area that you're metering is going to be partial metering.
And partial metering is going to be what we're really looking at is a very small percentage of the frame. So that's going to be heavily backlit subjects. I know that it said evaluative is useful for backlit subjects. I know it said that at the bottom of the screen there, but the reality is it's just not its forte, actually. Partial metering, or a small area that you're actually measuring, is going to be best for ignoring backlit subjects, and you just taking that middle part of the frame and pointing it right at the part of the subject you care about. Generally speaking, evaluative has the least fluctuation shot for shot, but it's the least accurate for any one individual part of the frame, where partial metering has the most fluctuation shot for shot, but the very middle area that you're measuring, that's going to be the area that is most accurate. I actually think center-weighted is the way that we should be shooting most of our images. It's very, very useful and does tend to ignore windows and backgrounds and things like that. So I find that to be useful. Our last option is quality. So let's talk a little bit about this, and then I'm going to tell you that you're really not going to touch this option very much. So the first is questions about JPEGs. So you've got the curve and then the size. The curve is the amount of compression, right? Very low compression creates a curve of a curved line on a curved subject. But when you have high compression, you actually see the shape of the pixels, and so curves start to look a little bit like steps. That's why the symbol in Canon for a more heavily compressed image is that little step-looking thing. It's a more compressed version of a curve. The L, M, and S is small, medium, and large, and you're going to notice that our pixel dimensions drop as we scroll through those options. We're seeing smaller and smaller and smaller number of pixels. So compression squeezes information out of pixels, basically by cloning color data, and then the size, large, medium, and small, is getting rid of the number of pixels. Now, if you are a JPEG shooter, this should be set to large and the curve, which is large and fine, which is what that actually stands for. I would never select any other JPEG. You can always take a JPEG and shrink it in size later on. It's no problem. I would never shoot in any of these other options. Now, I'm actually not a fan of RAW plus JPEG. If you're going to shoot RAW images, shoot RAW images. If you're going to shoot JPEG images, shoot JPEG images. But if you have a particular use for the JPEG, go ahead and shoot RAW plus JPEG. It saves every file in both qualities. Now, I'm a big fan of shooting every image in RAW. It gives you the most quality, the most capability, the most ability to edit the image afterwards, the most color richness and detail. I've got a video on that. Please do take a moment to watch it. But that's going to be where you get your most quality out of this particular camera. So if we change our exposure mode here, you're going to notice, first it tells me there's no card in the camera. I understand that. So now we're in TV, which is time value mode. AV stands for aperture value, and M is, of course, for manual. And now you're seeing the shutter speed is listed at the top left, because now I can change shutter speed whenever I want. I can go into that, and I can scroll around, and I can pick whatever shutter speed I would like to utilize. I don't actually have to do it through the quick menu. I can just spin the dial at the top of the camera, but I can go into it if I want, which is a nice thing. If I go to aperture priority mode, I would have the same capability, but with aperture. And in manual, what you're going to notice here, by the way, you notice how it said no card in camera, and the bottom right had two little brackets that were empty. That's saying that there's no pictures I can take. If you see a number in there, it's the number of pictures that you can shoot remaining on your memory card. Just something for you to know. So now I could select shutter speed, or I could go in and select aperture. f32 is grayed out because this particular lens does not stop down to f32. And it starts at f4 or 4.5 because that's what this particular lens can actually do. So that is the full quick menu for the Canon T6 and T7. Let me tell you how I would set this up. I'm a fan of shooting as manually as you are comfortable. If that's programmed for you right now, that's fine. And let's assume that it is, because this is not a video on understanding exposure or making exposure choices. ISO would be the first control that I would set. Auto, if you don't know really what you're doing with that, or you select an ISO as low as possible that gives you the shutter speed you need. Take a look at the images as you shoot them, and then adjust your exposure compensation in order to get the pictures the brightness you want. If you're shooting landscape images and would like to do a high dynamic range combination or tone mapping of an image, that's when you would turn on bracketing. Adjust flash compensation if you're using flash and if it's not giving you what you want. As for the picture style, if you're shooting in RAW, I would shoot it entirely in neutral. Otherwise, you can just leave it in auto. You can experiment with different looks. Different photographers work differently in that one. That's fantastic. I'd play around with it. See if there's something that fits your style as the photographer. In white balance, I would use auto as seldom as possible. I would use it only for mixed lighting conditions, but I would match my lighting condition to a white balance preset as often as possible. Sunny day, cloudy day, shade, etc. But if I'm in a very strange lighting condition, that's when having an 18% gray cloth is useful, and custom white balance off of it. By the way, I say cloth rather than card because cloths can be folded up, they take up less space, and they can also be used to clean the camera. And so I use 18% gray cloths rather than cards. When it comes to the enhancer, I would have it on, but I'd have it on low. I always leave my cameras set up for burst mode, one shot or AI servo based on the subject matter that you're shooting. Non-moving subjects, one shot. Moving subjects, AI servo. And then for the metering mode, I stay in center weighted pretty much exclusively. Image quality would always be either RAW or JPEG large, and JPEG large and fine is what is at the bottom right on the screen right now. So that is the initial setup and the quick menu of a Canon T6 and T7.
So there we have it, the quick menu for the Canon T6 and T7. There was a lot of stuff to get into there, but I hope that this was a really useful look at the camera and its feature set. Thank you for taking your time to come and check out the Camera Lessons Online YouTube channel. Of course, I'm going to ask you to like and subscribe. It's free, you knew that. And thank you so much for taking your time today to watch. I'll see you next time.